Today we're doing another episode of This or That. We get into my Bijan controversy. Let's see if you can agree with me or not on this one. Welcome to the climb. Alex, welcome back. Happy Father's Day in late day advance.
Yeah, it's good to be back. I, for one, am excited to watch you put your reputation on the line with an anti-Bijan stance here.
I feel, after researching it a little bit, I feel okay on my points. It's not just like a stance anymore. I feel like there's actual legitimate facts behind it.
We'll see how you feel at the end of this.
Yeah, I'm hopeful at a minimum.
All right, I'll be curious to see what you came up with, because I went the other way. The more I research, the more confident I feel about my stand here. So
I don't feel confident. I just feel mildly more safe.
Fair enough.
I'm almost not sick too, so that's a plus. I only cough like annoyingly now, and it's not as bad as it used to be. So
that's good to hear. All right, so you want to jump right in here? Another edition of This or That?
Let's do it.
All right, we'll go right into it here. We've got Bijan and Saquon.
So the endless tale here. Do you want me to get in on all my points right off the bat and see?
Yeah, if you want to, I'll let you tee off, and then I'll dive in.
All right. So Saquon averaged 16 points last year, excluding the season that he was injured the whole year, essentially. He's averaging 16.2, and that was with a down season 2 years ago. We're speaking whole out aside, too, that he's going to play. Everything's happy, healthy, and normal. So always what we talk about. We talk as these players are going to play 17 games, and everything's great. So I was looking at all the rookie running backs drafted in the top 10 in the last, I think it was 8 years. I think I went back to 2015. And there was 5 of them. So first one, Todd Gurley, who averaged 15.2. Zeke, who averaged 20.6, which is the second highest all time. Leonard Fournette, 16.3. Christian McCaffrey, 14.4. And Saquon with the highest ever at 21.3. So with that being said, I have all the other rookie running backs that kind of trail in with it. When we're getting down to the nitty gritty of everything is if we're drafting Bijan at 2, we're assuming that he's going to average at least 20 points a game, hoping that he does have that true RB top 5 potential. And I'm not saying it's not there. I'm just saying we're treating him as if he is going to take the world by storm right off the bat and essentially finish with the second best fantasy RB season in history of history. So that's tough for me to get on board with, especially at his ADP going at 9 when there's a lot of wide receivers that I like right there. I mean, we could get even people like AJ Brown the fall. You got Amon-Ra, CD, those guys sitting, Garrett Wilson, all those guys sitting around there that are clear elite receivers on their team. So that's my knocks against Bijan. The pluses for Saquon. His ADP is a little bit lower, middle of the second. If you take him at ADP, in theory, you're getting someone like Stephon Diggs, AJ Brown, even Travis Kelce if you want to go that route. I think that he is going to provide solid numbers again this year. Do I think he's going to be putting up 20 a game? Not necessarily, but I think he can be safe around 14 to 16 points a game. He's going to be a key piece in the offense, as long as he plays, of course. When you're taking one of the more elite wide receivers, AJ Brown's kind of the cutoff for me before the tier break. I like AJ Brown more than CD, Amon-Ra, and all of them. So you kind of get a higher end 1 wide receiver with a little bit of a lower end 1 running back, but I don't think the point difference can be that massive. If we're looking at the sense, we take these last 5 running backs that have been rookie top 10 picks, they're averaging 17.5 points a game. And that's if Bijan essentially has the best year possible, with the high end of 20, obviously. So, in my professional opinion here currently, I just like the idea of going wide receiver first on the count that you're starting 3 wide receivers every single week, and it's easier to get running backs later. And if you're going to go Saquon, I just think it's safer that you're going to get an overall higher point total between the wide receiver 1 that you would get in the first round at ADP compared to Bijan's later round.
Yeah, fair enough. A lot to unpack there. And I think I want to start with, obviously, you were pointing out some of the rookie numbers. So I want to start out with this. This is from Michael Dubner at RotoViz, Jack Miller at ETR, showing how rookies get more productive as the season goes on. And I know what the pushback is going to be here. It's like, well, isn't the green line higher? They score more points over the course of the year. The difference is the fear around the rookie lowers their price. So I know at face value, Bijan's more expensive than Saquon, but what does that tell you about where Bijan should be priced for the end of the year if, like you lay out, people are worried about the rookie year production? He's going to get better as the season goes on. This red line is going to be shooting off the graph by the end of the season for Saquon. So I think that's, we talked about it at length with some of the fear around JSN and the last this or that. And I do think the underdog market is getting sharper when it comes to these rookies, but I still think there's a little bit of a discount compared to where they should be priced for that late season scoring, which is all that we care about. So for Saquon in particular, he's a guy who I was very much in on last year. I think he was one of my higher owned running backs, had him in both of my redraft leagues, worked out pretty great. I just think he was good last year because he got the volume. And I know there's not any huge changes to the running back room, but the Giants did add Darren Waller. They did add Paris Campbell. They did add third-round rookie wide receiver Jalen Hyatt. So, I get those guys aren't great, but the pass-catching core is at least a tad better than it was last year. So maybe they're not quite as run-heavy as they were. And I just think that Saquon wasn't that efficient last year. He got there on the volume. If he, even not even looking at it from an injury sense, but another year older, another year closer to that age cliff, the regression that comes with it, I'm worried that if the volume takes any kind of step back at all, he's going to disappoint on price. And I think he's closer to the tier of running backs, the Pollard, Chubb, Ramondre, down around the 2-3 turn than he is to the Bijan Eckler tier.
Yeah, and I don't disagree with that. My main stance on it is that I just like the first round pick that you would get better than Bijan if you're taking them at ADP currently. Because I just don't, and I understand the point of rookies getting better as the season goes on, so on and so forth, and that's been proven. I mean, we can even go back, though, and look at Saquon's run in the playoffs last year just as a point. I mean, obviously any wide receiver, any running back at any point can put up big numbers. But his playoff run, week 15 was 20.5, 16 was 23.3, and disappointing in week 17 of 6.3. But I mean, there's always the chance for spike weeks, no matter any of these. I would say higher athletic players that we known have been elite at one point.
Right. I guess, but how do those spike weeks compare to the rest of his production? Right. I feel like that's probably pretty in line with what he was doing throughout the season.
Yeah, I would say I got his full numbers pulled up, and he really only had a few awful weeks. So week 11, he had 4.5. Week 14, he had 5.8. And then week 17, he had 6.3 points. Otherwise, he was sitting pretty well above. 10 is his next lowest game, 13.2. So he was averaging double digits pretty consistently throughout the year with a bunch of spike weeks.
Yeah, that's fair. And like before I shift back into the Bijan stuff, I mean, I do think like Saquon's at the top of that next group of running backs for me. Like if he continues to slide, I just need him to slide a little bit more closer to that turn. If I could start consistently getting him as my RB1 on a team that has Cup or Tyreek or any of the better receivers, like that's an easy click for me.
Yeah.
It's the mid-second that I'm still struggling with a little bit.
I'm still in love with the idea of eventually getting a Saquon Cup stack. I haven't gotten it yet.
I think I got one. Yeah. All right. So just before I dive into the Falcons, kind of what we're looking at with them going forward this year, and just kind of putting a bow on this rookie talk. This was Algier's projection from last year, just showing that spike that you get out of these rookies in the playoff weeks. So I know the difference here, Algier was a double-digit round pick in the fantasy drafts last year versus Bijan. But, I mean, this spike is real. It happens year after year late in the season, and it can be basically supercharging your best ball lineups.
It's the only thing that's hard for me is, like you said, Algier was taken way late in drafts compared to Bijan, and he's taken as the 2 or 3 off the board every single time. So it's just tough to, and I mean, rookies are always going to be tough to gauge no matter what. I mean, the range of outcomes for rookies are, I mean, Bijan realistically could be the one overall on the year, but I mean, more realistically in my eyes, it's probably borderline like 6, 7. And I think but like you said, the points are going to be back ended most likely. So,
yeah, personally for me, like the way that I play is I want to lean into that variance because I don't care if I finish 3rd or 12th. I get the same amount of money. So give me the high variance guy that could potentially turn into something big.
Yeah, that's a fair point. And it's like I said, I think ultimately part of it too is how you prefer the draft as a whole. I mean, the whole community seems to be a little more wide receiver loaded this year. Like wide receivers are going way, way earlier, and all these running backs that were going early last year are like falling into the second round. Jonathan Taylor's the perfect example, barring down year, but he's still the same player. Had really not that much different of a situation. His quarterback's a little bit more mobile, but I don't think that's going to reduce his opportunities drastically. I think it just kind of limits his touchdown upside.
Yeah, I think that the fear with him is if the receiving work goes down with A-Rich scrambling more.
Sure.
Well. All right, so for Bijan and the Falcons this year, I think one pushback I've seen is that, the Falcons were historically run heavy last year. They can't be as run heavy this year. And to that, I would say they're not going to be as run heavy this year because a big part of that run rate was Mariota's designed runs were really high. Desmond Ridder can scramble, but he's more like a Joe Burrow or a CJ Stroud. Like he'll only run when he has to. They're not going to be calling designed runs for Desmond Ridder. So that alone is going to pull the Falcons' pass rate up higher than it was, even if they don't change the amount of carries that the running backs are getting.
I think it's easy to argue too. That means Bijan's receptions are obviously going to be a little bit higher.
Yeah.
Than
what
was last year.
Arthur Smith's offenses going back to Tennessee have been bottom 3 in pass rate over expected in 3 out of the 4 seasons. And I think that's probably the biggest question mark for me with Bijan isn't if he gets on the field early or gets the carries. Like to me, that's a lock. The question is, are they going to pass the ball to him enough to be better than a Saquon?
Yeah. Yeah, because we know, I mean, the Saquon, I don't see Saquon's role changing that much. Like you said, the wide receivers and the receiving core in general has gotten better, but I don't see a world where Saquon drastically, he's still probably going to average close to 20 opportunities a game.
Yeah. The folks over at Fantasy Life had him projected for 270 rush attempts this season, not touches, rush attempts. And I went back and looked last year, only 3 players eclipsed 300 attempts last year, and all 3 finished top 5 in points per game for running backs.
It's pretty impressive.
I mean, if he gets those numbers there, I mean, he's a generational talent, better receiving profile than Jonathan Taylor coming out of college. So, like, I'm perfectly fine taking a stance on Bijan. It's played out in a big way in my exposures. I checked before we came on. I've got 4% Saquon and almost 14% Bijan right now.
So the point that I'll make that I will argue for Bijan, if I can guarantee someone basically that's ADP, essentially that's going like before Waddle, like if I get someone like Amon-Ra to pair with Bijan, I love it because we're still getting a high-end talent, 1 wide receiver. Otherwise, you're kind of reaching for either the wide receiver 2 on the team or someone that's essentially where I call that borderline, like I said earlier, that's a non-elite wide receiver, essentially. Not saying they're not elite, but just there's a tier break in the level for me.
Yeah. And I know in the past we've talked to, like, you're worried that teams are going to basically game plan for Bijan, but I did find a study that basically said the correlation between stacked boxes and fantasy points was minimal. Like, volume is a much bigger driver.
Sure. So, yeah, makes sense.
So, yeah, I don't know. I think, honestly, I would be comfortable taking Bijan as high as pick 6. Like, at that point, there's the tier break for me. Like, obviously, we're getting into a different argument positionally when it comes to Kelsey. Like, I don't have a problem if you want the elite tight end, but I do think there's a tier break for me between Diggs and AJ Brown and the Cup and Tyreek's of the world.
So you like Diggs more than AJ Brown, or is that like the same tier?
They're very. You could flip a coin for me in every draft between those two.
Okay. Yeah. No, I agree on that. It's like basically I have Justin Jefferson, Jamar Chase, Cooper Kupp, Tyreek Hill in that order as kind of like and like Hill's on the borderline of that 1.5. I kind of group Hill more in with the AJ Brown, Stephon Diggs level, essentially.
Yeah.
So I don't know.
It'll be interesting. It's I'm worried for you being anti-Bijan here.
Hey, if he ends up anything RB6 or less, I feel like my stance was okay.
No, I think that's probably a win for you.
So that's where my ground is going to stand, and hopefully I don't have any earthquakes around me.
All right. We'll keep it moving here for the next one. We've got Ken Walker versus your boy Miles Sanders.
All right. So we're standing more ground here. Ken Walker isn't too big of a controversial guy on our channel yet. I just brought up some of the main points. Ken Walker was 12.6 points per game. After week 5, he was 14.9 points per game. That's when he started basically becoming more of a full-time player. 67% of the snaps in that time period, had 2 big spike weeks of 28.8 and 26.4. Miles Sanders averaged 12.2 points per game on 57% of the snaps. As we know, Philadelphia is a running back by committee to a certain extent. Hurts vultured a lot of the touchdowns. However, Miles Sanders still had 11 touchdowns last year. So that was quite a lot. He had 2 spike weeks as well of 28.6 and 29.5. So basically, Ken Walker was more efficient once he became the full-time player. And Miles Sanders was kind of scary when I looked at the actual game stats from everything, because very, very consistently, let me go ahead and get Ken Walker pulled back up here, but Miles Sanders was all over the place on his stats. I mean, he was either really good for you or really, really bad. And then if you had him in the playoffs, he didn't do anything for you. I mean, he was borderline useless. 1.4, 5.6, and 6.1 in the playoffs. So this is me talking against my guy. Ken Walker, however, on the other hand, was at least like somewhat functional during the playoff season, 9.9, 11.5, and 14.7. And his upfront part when he got the full-time role was pretty good. He had an RB8, 3, 2. But then include those spike weeks. Otherwise, he wasn't anything super crazy. Kind of sat around, that 12-point range that we were talking about before. So Miles Sanders obviously has the new team. So I went ahead and looked into the Carolina Panthers running backs once McCaffrey left. So after that, Deontay Foreman averaged 11.3 points per game on 47% of the snaps. He had 2 spike weeks as well that shocked me. I didn't realize they were that big, of 31.8 and 22.5. And Chuba averaged 8.7 on 45% of the snaps, and he had one good game of 17.4. So obviously in Carolina at the time, it was very running back by committee. They pretty much split the snaps 50-50 at that point. And all the talk is Miles Sanders is going to be the bell cow. He's going to catch passes, so on and so forth. And I know Ken Walker really isn't much of a pass catcher, with Charbonnet especially coming in. But if Charbonnet eats into any of Ken Walker's touches, I'm a little bit worried in that matter. I do like Miles Sanders quite a bit if he's catching passes. I'm not saying he's going to end up getting 11 touchdowns again, or he's going to be a guy that takes on 70% of the snaps like he's projected to be right now. But even if he got up to that 60% of snaps range, I think he's going to be sitting pretty safely around 13 points a game with a couple spike weeks if he breaks off a big run. Just being a Philly fan and watching him over the years, that's pretty much where I never drafted him in fantasy for that reason, because I didn't feel safe about it. It just seemed like if he didn't break off a big run, you weren't going to get the production out of him. And I think going forward for best ball in Carolina, he's going to get a lot more consistency in his touches, and rookie quarterbacks like throwing it to the running back. So,
yeah, I think obviously I've been pretty anti Miles Sanders to this point, and I think the point I'll make, and it goes for both this pair and the next one we'll talk about, is it really comes down to talent versus volume. And for these best ball leagues, I side with talent pretty much every time, because I want a guy who can win me a week without getting all the touches. And I think at his cost right now, Miles Sanders is going to need to be more of that 3-down workhorse guy to get there. I think with all these running backs that I'm down on, Miles Sanders, guys going a little bit later like Cam Akers, James Conner. Actually, I like Conner. I won't include him, but like a Rashad White, a Cam Akers. Out of all these running backs, I do think, maybe one of them ends up getting all the volume and overperforming their ADP. But I think on the whole, these are guys where if they don't get the volume, they're going to be a disaster for your team. And so like the numbers that I pulled here, Ken Walker finished 4th in breakaway runs last year. And compare that to Miles Sanders, who finished last in percentage of yards gained after contact in each of his last 2 seasons. So like Ken Walker's efficiency numbers were not great. I mean, his success rate was, I think, 2nd worst after he took over. So like there are red flags to his profile. But even if Charbonnet eats into his work, you can at least draft Ken Walker knowing that he can take a carry 80 yards to the house.
Yeah, and I do agree with that. I think Ken Walker is more likely to do that. But like I said, I mean, it's just, and maybe I haven't laid as much of an eyeball test on Ken Walker as I have Miles Sanders. Obviously, I've watched Miles Sanders over the last 4 years or however long he's been playing. And it's pretty consistent in the fact that, I mean, it's no lie, as well as anybody else, that I never have been a Miles Sanders fan. And for whatever reason, he goes to Carolina and it just shoots up in my eyes. And I don't know if it's correlation of having Deontay Foreman just kind of be like a guy that came in and saved my team a couple times and when I was playing last year or what. But, I mean, I think Ken Walker obviously has more big play potential. The talent is there. There's very much a gap, and that is clear. I just, with the opportunity cost, like you said, it is talent versus opportunity. So I think Miles Sanders has the opportunity, can kind of even it out with the talent difference in this case, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think, I mean, so basically at their current ADPs, let's say they're not falling in the draft, are you still on the Sanders side?
Yeah, definitely. Especially because most likely I'm taking Sanders as an RB2. It seems like the wide receivers at 50 are a little more favorable in my eyes.
Yeah, I think for me, the struggle is I'm usually taking at least one, if not two running backs, or like a running back and a quarterback at that 2-3 turn.
Right.
So then coming back and taking Ken Walker, like I'm so far behind at wide receiver that those teams feel dead. So like I will say with both of these guys, I'm pretty much only taking them when they fall past ADP, but I've been more willing to take Ken Walker than Sanders to this point.
So let's just bring up a couple of the wide receivers at this point. That's around that ADP. We got like Ayuk, Chris Godwin, Michael Pittman. We're getting closer to Sanders. This is kind of guys that are going in between them. I know initially I didn't like this wide receiver group area a lot because this is where I was drafting a lot of TJ Hawkinson. I felt like just because I didn't like anybody at this range.
Yeah.
Kind of some of the higher names would be DJ Moore, Christian Kirk, Justin Fields is floating around there if you want to go quarterback wise. So,
Yeah, I think the struggle I have with Sanders is like that's a pretty good pocket of wide receivers in my eyes. Like even like I have no problem reaching a little bit into like the Deontay Johnson, Treylon Burks at that 5-6 turn if there is a pretty good wide receiver run. Just because I think when you are drafting in that part of the draft, like you can sometimes get locked out by the mid 80s and just have no wide receivers left.
yeah.
And then at that point, you can get a James Conner or a David Montgomery, guys who, to me, profile. It's not all that different from a Miles Sanders. You just have a 2-round discount.
And I think the partial argument too is there's a lot of Jacksonville guy. Well, like I'm very optimistic about Jacksonville, and I like that game stack. So I think that's kind of why I've been leaning in the Miles Sanders, knowing if I get someone like Ridley or if I want to like. Seems like Trevor Lawrence slides in drafts a lot more frequently than he should. So I've been kind of trying to take him when I can here and there, and it's easy to stack him with Ingram later in the draft. So it seems like Miles Sanders is another guy that can just be the high end stackable person in that game.
Yeah. I will add one thing on Walker because like I do think there is definitely downside risk here, like you mentioned with Charbonnet. I was actually surprised Walker had almost 30 receptions last year, so he wasn't a complete zero in the receiving game like a J.K. Dobbins is. I mean, he at least had some involvement. Maybe he loses that. I mean, there's just like we talked about with Bijan. There's a lot of range of outcomes here as far as how involved Charbonnet gets. So like I can understand that being a reason to fade Walker.
And just go back to your point too, where you were taking people more like when you're talking to Rashad White kind of ADP. A lot of times when we were drafting these drafts earlier, Jahan Dotson was sitting around there, and I think I was taking a whole bunch of Jahan Dotson at that point because his ADP has flown up the board. It seems like he's got to be one of the more higher risers in ADP recently too. So
yeah, it is crazy how that tier break at wide receiver has just gotten pushed up. I mean, it feels like pick 85 is the cutoff at this point.
Yeah, it's funny just like looking at it, just me realizing this as flipping through the ADP of like how my opinions have changed and where these guys have moved from in that point.
Yeah, I think like I kind of expected the opposite to happen. Like I expected the casuals to come in, which granted we're not, I mean, it's still June.
Yeah.
Like we're still 6 weeks away from August, but like I expected the running backs to be the risers. And to this point, it has just been more and more wide receiver steam.
So Dotson has moved up 6.5 picks. And that would put him at 75 currently, and he was at 82. And then Rashad White is at 84. And he was going at 79 at that point. Connor was at 84 back then, and now he's at 87. So their ADPs has fluctuated quite a bit. So
do you want to talk about the Jaguars for a bit as a segue into our next pairing here? Because I have actually been pretty underweight on the Jags to this point, and it's not even necessarily that I'm anti-Jaguars. I just think they are a little bit overpriced. Like Trevor Lawrence, I'm sitting at under 3%. Got 3% Evan Ingram, 5% of Etienne, a guy we're about to talk about here, and then Christian Kirk and Tank Bigsby are basically the only guys that I have more than 8% of.
Yeah, I'm pulling up my I don't have a whole lot of Etienne. I have 5% Etienne. And I think I probably got quite a bit. Nope, only 5% Tank Bigsby too.
Wow.
So I haven't had a whole bunch of them. I actually did some drafts today because I had an itch and I wanted to do some. And I took Lawrence in one of those. So I've drafted Lawrence at 8%. So I'm pretty low on these guys too as a whole.
Okay. Yeah.
Ingram's probably who I got the most of. Sorry for me. 8% Ingram as well. So I probably have stacked them every single time that I've gone that route from the way it sounds, which I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing. But yeah, the only Jaguar player that I don't think is kind of overpriced to a certain extent are the later receivers. If you want a spot start, for example, Zay Jones is
he is the guy that I've warmed up on the most because I was very much not taking him. And then after listening to some of the Fantasy Life team previews and just with how gross that range is overall for wide receiver, he's kind of been the one who I've started clicking. And if I am locked out at wide receiver and, only have 4 at that point in the draft.
Right. So I think my correlation with drafting a lot of Miles Sanders initially has come with being favorable to someone like Zay Jones. Otherwise, I mean, it does get scary. You can't get an elite piece of that offense very easily whatsoever.
Right. No, I definitely think part of the reason I'm a bit lower on them as a whole is just because I'm usually trying to set up other correlations and pairings at that point, and then I get locked out because there's no Jags worth clicking after pick 130.
Yeah, and it's really, really tough, because it's a weird game stack too, because it's one that could be a 40-point game very, very easily, or there could be 30 points total.
Yeah.
So.
All right, we got a little bit off track there, but we're going to be talking Etienne versus Najee. I'll start us off this time. I think this one for me is pretty similar to the Ken Walker versus Miles Sanders in that Etienne basically offers the home run hitting ability, whereas Najee is the volume play. So right off the bat, I pretty confidently come in on the Etienne side. The fear here, and I wish I had saved the tweet, but I saw at some point that somebody posted basically a chart of how often each quarterback checks down to their running backs, and Lawrence was actually extremely low on that chart. So I think that's part of why Etienne hasn't had great receiving numbers to this point, which is kind of surprising to me because the two pretty sure they played together at Clemson.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. So you'd think they'd have a little bit more of a connection in the passing game, but I definitely think the passing game involvement is a concern for Etienne, but kind of the same way here. With Najee, we're basically betting he's getting all the volume, and if he doesn't, he's going to be a terrible pick at ADP. Whereas Etienne, you can draft him, you get the home run hitting upside, and then if he does end up getting more volume than we're expecting, he's going to be a smash at ADP. But I'll just say in general, I've also been pretty low on both of these guys.
Yeah, and just to, touch more on your points that you basically said word for word. Najee averaged 12 points per game last year. Etienne averaged 11 points per game last year, so about the same. However, Najee only had 2 games under 9 points, and Etienne had 8 games under 9 points. So that is very much the boomer bust situation, and I mean that's a major part of best ball. I really like Etienne more and more, like thinking about it, because I do think, as I've talked about endless times now, I'm very in on Trevor Lawrence, and I think as long as this offense scores more and more points, they're in a pretty bad division as a whole, which gives them the opportunity to have a lot of points throughout the season. And in comparison to the Steelers division, where they're most likely the worst team, arguably the worst team, at least, I just think there's more points in Jacksonville than Pittsburgh in general, even though there's a lot of people that we like. But I like we've been really high on Jaylen Warren, for example. But I think that's a cost value thing. So at this,
good.
Yeah, just at this point, Etienne, if you're getting them at these guys around the same cost, I think it's a lot safer to go with the home run play in this world, just because it's a couple of rounds before what we were talking about earlier.
Yeah, I think I won't rehash everything with Najee that we talked about when we talked Jaylen Warren on the last this or that, but obviously definitely some concerns with his basically being outplayed by Jaylen Warren in terms of explosiveness. Even going back to Najee's rookie year before he had the foot injury, he was not a super explosive guy, did not have many plays at all where he had more than 20 yards on a run. Whereas Etienne, he finished 5th in carries over 15 plus yards last year and was 6th in breakaway run rate according to PFF. So the other thing with Najee too, I feel like we're still attached to this image of who he was in his rookie year when he caught 90 balls from Noodle Arm Big Ben. And I don't know, maybe it was 90 targets, not 90 catches, but either way, he only had 50 targets last year. Kenny Pickett is not a check down king like Big Ben was. So
no, and just going back to that rookie stat I have pulled up here, that Najee's rookie season was the 6th best ever by a rookie. So I think that also gives a lot of, if we're still holding on to that, I mean, it's a whole nother world now. Najee only had 1 game over 20 points last year in comparison to Etienne had 3. So in best ball with those massive spike weeks, like you said, that's what wins you weeks sometimes, keeps you up on afloat. So
yeah,
at this point, if you're looking at the same thing, I'd rather take a shot on a guy that's going to score a bunch of points versus a stabilizing piece.
Yeah, and final point with Najee, because I mean there are points where I'm drafting and Najee falls, and I'm questioning my fade on him basically because I don't know how much I have, but it's got to be really low, 2% Najee, but I subscribe to Legendary Upside. That's Pat Crane, last year's WrestleMania 3 winner site. I checked his ranking. Out of any top 80 pick, he has Najee as the most overpriced player right now relative to ADP. So
that's crazy.
So I feel that gave me some confidence when I started to feel skittish on fading Najee.
Yeah, no, it's reasonable. I completely agree. I mean, like I said, I think Etienne is just the better player currently. Better offense, everything about it just seems. And Jaguars are going to be more likely to be winning games in comparison to the Steelers. Kind of the base points I already touched on, but more likely to be on the ground than the Steelers. And that's one reason why I think I'm so high on somebody like Deontay with positive touchdown regression.
Yeah. And speaking of touchdown regression too, interesting thing I found when I was reading up on Etienne, he had 220 carries last year and he had 45 red zone touches, but he only had 5 total touchdowns and finished RB23 in points per game. The thing that stood out to me there is 45 red zone touches, on average, would put him closer to 13 touchdowns, which is more of Nick Chubb level numbers. So there is room here to the upside. It just depends how much a guy like Tank Bigsby gets involved.
Yeah, very true. I mean, a lot to be determined. It's going to be a weird year because I feel like there was quite a bit of like backup running backs now that have the not not a safe role in the offense, but a more prevalent role in the offense. Um, just like people, even I'm trying to think of random backfields, like New Orleans, for example. Even if Kamara's plays, no worries about him or whatever, I think Jamal Williams could very easily get the goal line work. Kentre Miller maybe get more of the third down work. So it's just there's so many backfields in my eyes that kind of have that just uncertainty, at least. Seattle, we just talked about it.
Yeah, I think it's tough part of navigating these best ball drafts for sure. Any final thoughts here on these guys or any of these pairings?
Nope, I lean Etienne, and that's all I got to say on this one.
All right, well, I think we did a pretty good job of not talking for an hour and a half to these guys.
I'm sure we could have too. We for a change, hopefully you guys made it to this point in the video, and if we do, we thank you very much as always. Like we said before, happy Father's Day, a little bit late, as I'm a dad, so things are getting old for me, like my body. So any last thoughts on your end?
Yeah, just add definitely hit the like button, subscribe to the show, let us know in the comments which of these players you prefer at their current cost, and then upcoming schedule for the show, we'll have another Best Ball in 15 up over the weekend, and then we're going to be starting a Best Ball tips series. I think sometimes me and EJ, when we're doing these draft videos, get very deep into the weeds, so wanted to have a playlist of videos out there for anybody out there who's watching our stuff and maybe a beginner. So we're gonna have the first tip video up on Monday, and that'll become a weekly thing moving forward. So, but yeah, that's all I got. Thanks everybody for watching another edition of The Climb.